Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Tracy Cook. I'm the online media manager for ModernAnalyst.com, the premier community for business analysts. I'd like to welcome you today for today's webinar entitled Manage Your Requirements in Any Methodology, Agile, Traditional, or Hybrid. Today's featured speakers is Clara Chismero, the product manager at Polarion Software. This webinar today will last approximately 60 minutes, including the question and answer session at the end. So be sure to submit your questions in advance using the question feature of the GoToWebinar software. And at this time, I will turn it over to Clara to get us started.
What is the percent of successful projects in your company? By successful, I mean a project that finishes on time, on budget, and with satisfactory results. According to the Standish Group, only 29% of overall projects are successful, 52% are challenged, and 90% are failed. But actually, when you look at the size of the project, you will find out there's a big difference. Small projects, indeed, are much more successful, 78%, and this is closer to the average reported by PMI, so they reported about 64%, and only 4% failed. But large projects, and by large I mean projects with more than $10 million, only 10% are successful, and 38% are failed. So this is huge. What is the cause of this? Well, PMI identified that the second main cause for project failures is a poor requirements management. How can we manage requirements better? Good evening, everybody. I'm Clara. It's nice to have you all here, and I'm trying to give you the answer to this question. Before we start, please allow me to tell you a few words about Polarion. Polarion Software is a leading innovator in a web-based requirement management, quality assurance, and ALM solutions since our first product release in 2004. We serve companies of different sizes in a broad spectrum of industries. The unique differentiators include the fact that Polarion ALM is based on a single unified artifact repository orchestrated by powerful workflow engine and 100% web-based solution that enables to streamline collaboration, transparency, and release predictability, as well as regulatory standards compliance. Before we start to talk, to enter into the core of our presentation, I would like to look a little bit of what is a requirement. Let's see, we have a definition here of a software requirement. It can be a condition or capability needed by a user to solve a problem or achieve an objective, or a condition or capability that must be met or possessed by a system or system component to satisfy a contract, a standard specification, or other formally imposed document. The reason I am starting with this definition is because we talk today about managing requirements in any methodology. And you know that in Agile, people tend to think that we don't have requirements. Some of them even think, we don't manage requirements. We have user stories, we define them when we need to implement it, we don't need to do that. But according to this definition, user stories are requirements. And regulators also agree that user stories are requirements. Let's start first with the definition between the agile and traditional requirements. The first difference is about the time when they are written. The traditional requirements are usually written up front, so before the implementation is done. We have the full details of what the system should do, how it should be implemented. As opposed to this, in Agile, the requirements, mainly these user stories, are detailed only shortly before the sprint. When the working software is defined, is more important than the comprehensive documentation. In some teams, if they agree with this, these user stories might not be even completely defined before the implementation starts, and it can be adjusted during the sprint. The second difference is how these requirements are written. So let's think about the traditional requirements. They look like this system shall do this and shall do that, and lots of details. The user stories are more simple. I, as a user, I want to do this because I need that, or because I need to achieve this objective. Now, how they are formulated, I mean, this I as a user want or the system shall, is just a matter of form. But the main difference here, it's about the content. The traditional requirements describe in very little detail what should be implemented, how it should be implemented, what is the solution. As opposed to this, in Agile, we describe what we want to implement and why. I mean, by what, meaning what the user wants and why. But we leave the freedom of the development team to decide what is the best way to implement it, what is the best way to solve this problem. And together with this what and why, we usually have some acceptance criteria that define what is the definition of done. The third difference is about the lifespan of the requirements. Imagine long time projects that take many years. In the traditional way, requirements and the specifications are written up front. We already talked that. But these have to be maintained when they are done. Why? Because this specification serves as a documentation. They need to reflect the current state of the system, because if we need to find out how the system works, how the system was implemented, we need to look here. In Agile, if we look at the user stories, we do not find the right answer, or we might not find the right answer, because user stories describe the increments only, not the current state. Let's think of the project that takes years. We would have more user stories that totally contradict each other. It is very difficult to find out the current state of the system only if you look at the user stories. You can get completely confused and wrong. That means that once the user stories are implemented, when they are done, they are discarded. That doesn't mean that we recommend you to delete them, but it means to remember that they are not useful when they are done. Summarizing. Okay, I have a question here. What are we comparing here? We are comparing requirements between the traditional methodology of managing requirements or traditional methodology in a project and the Agile one. And we were talking about the differences between the traditional and Agile. Now, to summarize this difference in few words, the traditional way of managing requirements is that one of command and control. Command means we know very well what we want to implement from the beginning and how we want it to be implemented. We write the requirements, and then during the implementation and after the implementation we control, so because we need to make sure that these requirements are implemented exactly as we want it. In the Agile way, the command actually transforms into command. Command means to entrust the developers that they understand what they need to do, they understand the objective, and give them the freedom to find what's the best way to do it, and let them self-organize. Support means to give them the tools that they need or the means that they need to achieve their objectives. Now let's look also at common problems. Yes, you heard it right. There are not only differences between methodologies, there are also problems, even if you are using Agile. First one is the fact that typical requirements are too big. Let's look at the traditional requirements. They are usually described in very long documents, and each chapter might represent a requirement. User stories can be large too in complex projects. They might be valid from the point of view of the user, describing very well what the user wants, but they might not be valid from the Agile methodology, because according to it, ideally, is to write very small user stories that can be implemented, for example, by a team of 5 to 8 people in 1 to 3 days. Large requirements pose many challenges. First of all, the estimation. It's really difficult to estimate something that is very, very long, very big. And how many times you actually got a correct estimation? Sometimes I ask myself, why do we estimate things? Because it seems that all the time they are incorrect. And even worse, our estimations are shorter than the actual time that we take to implement these requirements. Then we have a problem with the verification. Is this requirement really covered by test cases? How do you measure the test coverage? Was this requirement fully tested? And we have the validation. How many times what was implemented was actually different than what you asked for? When you have a complex system, it's really, really easy to make a mistake or to forget something or to forget to read something. So it's really a challenge. Then it's about being able to validate, to assess the change impact. What if I want to change this line? What will be affected? Then we might have teams that want to improve the way they work. They want to be more efficient. How do you identify this area for improvement? For example, things like how much time you spend on implementing the user story, how many issues this one has. If you find a component that is more buggy, and if you look at the correlation to the test cases, you might discover something that needs to be improved. The second problem, the second common challenge, no matter the methodology, is about requirements that are not written. And I'm not talking here about the requirements that are not written up front in Agile when development of the user story starts, because I think this is fine. So it's part of the methodology, is okay. I'm talking about two types of problem. One is about the non-functional requirements. So this can be security, performance, regulatory, compatibility with other systems, practically anything that is not related to how the system behaves. This can be easily forgotten. We had a problem when we released the main product that we broke one of the old integrations for a partner. And looking from outside, it sounds normal when you release something to verify all the projects that are dependent of it. But let's face it, when it sometimes is too complex, and if it's not written exactly, it is very easy to forget. So we are all humans, and we need to be helped to remember. In our case, the solution was we'd identify that our test cases don't contain all the tests that we need to do with all the systems that are dependent. The second non-written things are the changes. The changes that happen and they are not tracked. So imagine that you do a change, but still your specification contains only how the system was supposed to behave before the change. You have now an inconsistency there, and you don't know what is the current state of the product. Many times, Responsible for this is the requirement management system that is really difficult to use and where it's difficult to track this change. Or it can happen that people use this requirement management system only in the initial phase of development, so only first time when they implement this requirement, and they don't use it any longer for the change. What is the solution for all these challenges? We think it's the hybrid process, and let's see how we define it. Let's look first at the user stories versus requirements. I think it is really, really important to highlight that user stories and requirements are complementary. I know we talked about this in our previous webinars where we talk about Agile. We continue to talk because we think it's important. So they are like yin and yang. There's no side of them is right or wrong. They are just complementary. They represent a different aspect of how we work. On one side, user stories are estimable, they are short, they are feasible to be implemented, they are ordered in a backlog, and they are not hierarchical. Requirements, in general, should be structured. So when we speak about specifications, we do not talk just about plain Word documents. We talk about documents where each information is uniquely identifiable and traceable. They are heavily overlapping, so it does not make much sense to prioritize them. But if you use this specification also as an input for the top level user stories or epics, so before these detailed user stories are defined, we can recommend that you can track their importance. So something like this requirement is a must-have, a should-have, or a nice-to-have. Now we have this process. You can see here the different inputs to the user stories that are part of the prioritized backlog. We can see the test procedures, and you see the activities that are performed during the sprint. The key difference in this hybrid approach are the component specifications. By component specification, I mean a supplementary documentation that needs to be maintained. Its purpose is to ensure consistency, because it is not realistic to rely only on source code documentation if we speak about software with more than 10 million lines of code. We need this supplementary documentation. We need to know how the system works. We need to know how it is intended to be used. And this is recommended to be updated in every sprint. We were working together with TÜV Nord, that's a German certification authority for ISO 26262. It's for functional safety in automotive development. And they share with us that Polarion is the first company that they certified that was actually practicing the Agile methodology. We are using Scrum here. And I wanted to tell you, because it's really interesting, that the outcome of the certification was that for them, it doesn't matter much when the documentation is actually written. What it matters is that this documentation exists and that it covers the full scope. They also liked on Agile the fact that software is built incrementally with continuous verification, reducing the number of functional changes. Because as they share, the most common reason for a functional issue, usually, so when something fails, is not because we had a wrong development from the beginning. Most of the time, the problem is that because this was changed, but nobody looked at the impact of this change. And since we are talking about change, it's not only that the number of functional changes are reduced by Agile, but you have to think that change is part of life. It will surely happen. It is important to avoid the problem indicated by TÜV by assessing the impact of the change correctly. First, we have this supportive documentation. For a project of 20 million lines of code, this might be about 50,000 requirements. It must be possible, it is mandatory to be possible to navigate through all this documentation easily. This is why the requirements should be traceable, and you should be able to navigate from the line of code to the requirement, and from the requirement to the design documentation. Second, it is a very big difference if we can review the impact of possible change in one place, accessing all the available resources. For example, the access preview of an UML document or a Simulink system model, just as part of my component specification document, rather than going to all different tools and search for them. These are tiny little details that make a difference to be or not to be able to analyze the impact of a change request, even if we do not actually want to change the existing functionality, but rather add another feature consistently. So there's a question if you can take the webinar record. So we will publish the recorded version of the webinar on our website shortly after this webinar ends. Now, what are the best practices in hybrid methodology that we talk about? We need to ensure that user stories are short and condensed. Second, we need to track the detailed functional specification as part of component specification document. So we need to have this component specification document, and we need part to the user story so that the definition of done is able to include all these linked functional requirements and to make sure that all of them are covered. Definition of done can be automated by workflow. For example, it is possible in the workflow to mark a story as implemented only if the linked functional requirements are covered by test cases. These cases are executed, all of them, and the result of the execution is successful. We've completed now the fundamental part of requirements management, and we show how the hybrid model responds to most of the challenges identified earlier. I think it's time to talk about few advanced topics. One is parallel version development, and the second one is about regulatory requirements. How do we manage requirements when we have to develop multiple versions simultaneously? For example, you have the upcoming version where you need to add the new functionalities, but at the same time, you have an existing version actually one or more versions in the market that you need to maintain. It can be the same team that works on all these versions in parallel, or you can have different teams. Well, first of all, it's really important to realize that user stories are version specific. What I mean by this is, remember that user story describes the work to be done, to be coded, merged, refactored for a specific version. When we develop multiple versions, we could have more stories. For example, we can have in version 2, so the future version, we need to implement this button, and in version 1, the current version, we need to merge this button functionality. So for this reason, we need to branch these user stories in different versions. Now, how about component specification that we talked about before? That we said that it needs to be linked to these user stories, where, as you see, the component specifications have to be branched too, especially if they need to be different in two parallel versions. Now, what are the best practices for branching specifications? Well, as you guessed, and as you see, is the same as for code. So the same principles apply here too. You keep one branch for the head, or the way we call it in development, the trunk development. This is where you document the new features and the current changes. And then, if these changes are needed to be ported back to the older versions, then you need to create different branches for each version. Let's talk about the regulatory requirements. In regulated or standardized environments, in addition to the requirements that describe how the system works, you need to make sure that the system complies with the regulations or the standards. And you don't necessarily have to think about these requirements as needed to be done just because the government wants you to do them. So most of the time they will ensure that the system is better. Maybe it doesn't pollute or not so much. It protects the privacy. It prevents harming the people. And what I would like you to remember or to notice is the fact that the regulatory requirements are a typical example of the non-functional requirements. So we talked a little bit about this earlier when we talked about the common challenges of the Agile and Traditional. Let's recap a bit and enter into more details now. Non-functional requirements are these requirements that need to be done, but they are not part of the description of how the system works. They can be anything from performance to security to functional safety. Some of these non-functional requirements are specific to a user story. For example, the login page needs to respect the security standards for the user credentials. Some other non-functional requirements can be general. So it means that they can apply to more user stories or to the whole system. For example, the performance of the whole system should not be affected by any new feature or by any change. Or the example that I mentioned before, where we failed in the past, that the product must, or this functionality must not break the other products it interacts to. Usually these non-functional requirements need to be reused easily across many projects. Now, one way would be to copy-paste them in every requirement, in every user story, over and over again. But this is not feasible. First, that it takes you a long time to do that. It's very easy to forget something. But the most important is, if you do want change, it's very difficult to update this change in all the places where you copy-pasted it. So that's a big no, no. The platform that you use needs to also ensure that the people do not forget about these non-functional requirements. What is the solution? Well, first you need to write them down separately, so you have specific non-functional requirements written in the system. Then you need to link them to the user stories that are affected by them. And then you need to version them. And the right version has to be distributed to each project. Now, why is it important to link these non-functional requirements with your other user stories? First of all, is to make sure that they are not forgotten. Then you need to make sure that the information that you need is instantly available, just one click away. then you need to make sure that the definition of done of the user story, or that the potentially shippable product is ready and is easily defined. Now, if this non-functional requirement is specific to a user story, this will be included in the definition of done of this user story, and this means that it will be tested. It will be part of the test cases of these user stories, and this will not be ready unless these non-functional requirements are met. Now, if for the generic non-functional requirements, now they don't need to be included in the acceptance criteria of every user story, because it might be really difficult and time-consuming to test it so often. What we recommend is to include them, to cover this by test cases and to execute them regularly. For example, at the end of sprint, or because this is the time when you need to ensure that you have a potentially shippable product. Now, if you remember at the beginning, we talked that the second main cause for project failures is poor requirement management. And it's not only about gathering the requirements, but it's about everything, implementing them, making sure that nothing is forgotten, that is implemented as requested, that the changes are tracked. It is really, really critical to do requirement management well. Now, you have to think that we are all human beings. And when the system we work at is very complex, it is very easy for our brains to forget. Now, how many times you've been working on something, and when you finally manage to implement it, you've been so happy, but at the same time so drained of energy that you couldn't look and think about all the other details that would ensure that everything works well. So what I'm talking about here is the solution to this is to switch from an approach of command and control. So what we talked earlier, I know everything up front and I'm controlling that you do everything right, to a more people-centric approach. This means trust them to do the job and give them the support to do it right. As the Agile Manifesto says, the individual interactions is more important than the processes and tools. So, it is not necessarily about the tools. We need to put the people in the center. What it means that we need to give them tools that are easy to use and that allow them to collaborate. Now, here in Polarion, we do our best to give our users a tool that makes them feel comfortable in their working environment and that they collaborate with ease. First, we have a unified artifact repository. Every information is one click away. We know that in real life, you may need to manage extra large enterprise data, or hundreds of projects, or millions of requirements. In one unified repository, optionally across multiple servers, without compromising performance and usability, you can do it. The second thing is the possibility to collaborate securely. So it's not only to allow the distributing teams to collaborate. They have to do it securely. Collaboration doesn't mean that everybody can access absolutely everything and all the time. We enable teams to collaborate on shared assets easily. You can decide who can see what, who can change what, and when, via granular permission controls, and we have a robust configurable automation workflow. And the Polarion is easy to use. We have, it is authoring requirements, it is as easy as using Word, with none of the disadvantages on the data management side. We design our solution with a deep understanding of the different user roles, and we have a built user interface that adjusts to fit to your need. As one of our customers says, in comparison to other systems, working with Polarion ALM is like a walk in the park. Thank you all for listening, and now it's time to take questions. Okay, we have one question. We use Atlassian Jira and Confluence. What are the Polarion advantages over them? So there are a lot of advantages. Some of them are the ones written here. But one that I would like to point out very well, think about Jira. It is usually fitted, so it started as a task management tool. And I know it's very well known, especially for the software teams. But if you look at the majority of their customers, Jira works very well in non-complex systems, in non-regulated environments. We talk here about complex systems. When we talk about regulations, we need a tool, first of all, that allows the people to elaborate, to write the requirements faster, to track these artifacts easily, to be able to have templates that allows these companies to show that they meet the regulations, to make sure that they don't forget something. So it's a big difference. Mainly it's about the target market that we have, and we have completely different target market. Okay, another question is, can we see a demo of ALM? Yes, you can see it, and we have it on our website. So if you go, let me see if I can even open here. If you go to Polarion.com, just give me 1 second, because I would even want to show you how to do it. So this is Polarion ALM. And it's possible here to either schedule a live demo, or you can have a test drive where you can try it yourself. Okay, let's take some more questions that are related to more related to the content. Okay, there's one question to elaborate more on the differences between user stories and requirements. I don't know if you were present from the beginning where we talk about this. So mainly, I think we don't have much time to go into into all these details, and I think we can even discuss this offline. So mainly requirements are something that, so they are details that are written, might be upfront. So we talked about if you use a hybrid approach, then you define them high level, how the system is intending to work, what the user wants, all kind of details. User stories usually are very, very small increments. You need to have in mind that user stories need to be so small so that the team can finish it in a sprint. And because you want to plan more user stories in the sprint, and you want to have them finish in the sprint, you need to make sure that they can be done in less than a sprint time. So we talked earlier, it should be in about between 1 and 3 teams days. That means that you will only define one small functionality. I want to implement this screen, to have this screen that gives access to the user to the system. Or I want to be able to link work items. Or I want to, whatever you need, something that is really small. Requirements usually describe, describe how the system works into more detail. So I think we should take this offline, because now I think I will spend days to talk about the differences. There's another question: if the deck will be available. We will have available the recorded version, so you can access it. Let's see more what it was at the beginning. Okay, what is your documentation in Agile? So we talked earlier. Let me see if I can go back to. It's better to show you what I mean. Okay, here. I wanted to get here. There are many people that think that in Agile you don't need to manage documentation, because one of the Agile manifesto principles says that you need to value working software to comprehensive documentation. What does it mean? It doesn't mean that you don't need to have documentation. You don't need to have necessarily comprehensive documentation. Like, think about it. In the past, we had a lot of, okay, we have requirements, we develop the software, and then we start to write down what we did. And it takes a long time, and maybe you even forget what you need to do there. Now, in the Agile projects, people said, okay, we give up the documentation, we don't need to write it. Every developer makes sure that the source code is documented. Then we use some special tools that compiles all this documentation, and voila, we have the documentation created. But this is not enough. This is not enough because if the project is really complex, it can be a lot of documentation there, and it can be really difficult to identify what is that part that relates to my change. What is that part that relates to my initial requirements? What if later I change something? Was this part of documentation or this part of the code updated by the developer or not? Even more, was this developer able to describe correctly what was implemented there, or he just wrote something like just one simple phrase that it's impossible to be understood? So for these reasons, we talked in our webinar that we recommend to write a separate artifact that we call the component specification. So every time, and every sprint, when you have a user story, you need to make sure that you document how the system works now. Now, in the next sprint, if you add a new functionality or if you modify this functionality, you need to ensure that you update this component specification to reflect your current state. And you need to make sure that this component specification is linked to the original requirements. And this component specification is linked to the test procedures. So then when you will need to check whether the current system meets the regulatory compliance, whether all the requirements have been covered by tests, whether they have been executed, you can see them all by looking at all this traceability tree. So let's see another question. I hope this answered it. So there are lots of answers here, and yes, I can talk for days for this. So I'm trying to take more. So how do you manage records or history of the completed deliverables? So again, we talk about having these component specifications. Now, ideally is that your tool allows you to create this as a separate artifact. In Polarion, we use these documents. They look like Word documents, but actually the difference is that you can take parts of these documents and mark them as individual artifacts. And you can link this to other artifacts in the system. So what it means is, let's imagine that you have this specification of how the system works, and this specification has different chapters, and each chapter is a component. This component specification should describe the latest status. So the latest, we already talked, right? After the implementation, you have to update this part in the document. And this component specification also is linked with the user stories and the requirements that generated it. So this way you make sure that you can always look to see how the component works, and you can also make sure that you can trace everything that's impacted in case in the future you need to do some change. There's another question. If Agile doesn't let new people know the history of application of project, then these days, why do we focus on Agile? So I think this is a very good question, and if I'm right, I think you refer to the fact that, let me go back to the slides. Here, where I said that the user stories are discarded when done. Well, Agile is very good because it allows you to develop in increments. It allows you to get to incorporate constant feedback. It allows you to validate it very often. So the main goal is to have this potentially shippable product all the time. Agile definitely is good. I can tell you that it works because, as we said, we also use Agile here. So we use Scrum. And I've used in the past, I worked in the waterfall methodology, and I can tell you that's a big difference. Because there was a lot of waste in the past, so I had to create to define all the detailed requirements. Even more, I had to pretend that I'm the specialist and I know better than the developers how a problem will be solved. So it was absolutely excruciating, and of course something happened on the way. Of course that people found out that what I wrote there maybe wasn't correct, that there was some other solution, or maybe they were not able to implement exactly what I requested and they needed to do something else, or maybe we didn't have enough time to implement everything because we estimated it wrong, and now we needed to do some scope creep. So Agile allows you to adapt to all these changes. So that's why we talk about Agile. Now, I think the problem is to take Agile as it is, like literally as it is. I have Agile, I'm not looking at the history, I'm not doing the documentation, because I just figure out when something happens what to do, and I don't care of what I did in the past, as long as I have a software that it works. And this is what we think is wrong. And that's for this reason we talked in this webinar about this hybrid approach, that you need to also document your software. And it's not about spending lots of time of writing something very complicated. It can be very short, as long as you make sure that you update it in each sprint. Let's see. I will take one more question because I think we are getting closer to the end of our time. Okay, so as a new colleague of a company, how can I get to know a system that was developed under Agile? What kind of documentation shall be expected? Thank you. I think first you will know by asking your colleagues what they are using, because I suppose when you join a company, you need first to learn how your colleagues work, what is the company culture. So you need to learn to get used to their procedures. So this is how you know at least what they declare that they use. Now what they've done in reality, that's a different story. I think in Agile I don't expect to find a standard documentation. So usually what you recognize in Agile, if you look at the ALM system, if you use an ALM system, or if you use some requirement management system, or whatever you use in a company, you will see that you have a backlog of user stories. So usually this backlog is the first sign that you are using Agile. Now everything else depends on the company. So far I haven't seen any company that is using Agile in the strict way. So I think that everybody has their own way of understanding it and using it and adapting it. Okay, so Tracy, I think you can take this over because we are at the end of our time. We have a lot of questions here. I will look at all of them and I will contact you, each of you separately with the answers. Thank you very much for listening and thank you very much for being such an active audience and asking so many questions. Tracy?
Thanks so much, Clara. That was a great and very informative webinar today. We're seeing a lot of positive comments, and I really thought the questions were great. I'd like to thank everyone for attending today's Modern Analyst webinar, and I'd like to remind everyone that today's webinar, along with the slides, will be archived at ModernAnalyst.com within a few days. This concludes today's webinar. Thanks, and have a great day.